Hey folks, it is Alex Wiseman here talking to you about globalization and contextualization. We are now in week 10 and we're talking about political realities of globalization and contextualization for the second week in a row. A little slightly different set of readings, but some of the same ideas going through this, and I think I'll see how that will develop as we go along. The first thing I wanted to do was actually just start us with a little bit of a broader context, and one of the ways to do that would be to look at the discussion board as a way to get some of our comments flowing. So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to go to the discussion board for our course, and we're going to look at some comments specifically related to the Baker book, The Schooled Society, before we dive into a little more explanation of some of his core points. And that will help us, I think, lay some of the foundation for these political realities. Okay, so we're just looking at one of the recent comments posted on our class discussion board. What I think is really interesting about this is, first of all, the directness and the honesty. And if you posted this, you know who you are. And I appreciate that because I like the critical perspective, I like the point of view. And I think it's important to think about some of the things that this person is saying. So it's a comment that is addressing the contrast between Ronald Doerr's idea of the diploma disease and David Baker's idea of the schooled society. Because what David Baker does, as you've noticed in his chapters, is he sets up sort of a little bit of a straw man with Ronald Doerr and the diploma disease to talk about how there's a contrast to a more of a neo-Marxist, purely sort of power and resource-oriented approach to thinking about education, and one that looks at education from a bit more of an institutional perspective. So the idea of credentialing is one of the ones that we read a chapter on recently. And the comment is, from my experience within international education and from my mentor's input from within the field, there has been such over-education in the field that it is near to impossible to obtain a job in the field or to advance in the field without a master's degree. As my mentors put it, switch the apostrophe there, it didn't matter what the master's degree was in, just so long as you got the piece of paper. And what this person says is, I feel like David Baker looks at things from a very idyllic or idealistic point of view. Yes, the skills learned in college do help to be more professional and heightened thinkers. However, there are so many more people who have achieved those same skills, and even more people on that path, that employers continually raise the entry qualifications for positions. Even entry-level positions recently request a minimum of 1 year work experience. And so I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, there's a much larger quote that goes on here. But what I want to address right off the bat is I'm not exactly sure what the contrast is then between Doerr and Baker. Because the diploma disease argument is that there's this spiraling upward of educational attainment and credentialism, so that higher and higher levels of attainment and more credentials are required to transition into the labor market or into the economy or wider society in general. And I guess the assumption is that Baker is looking at this as if it is a positive thing. And I think that we have to be careful about confusing an observational account with a support or an advocacy account. And I think the way that Baker is looking at it is more of an observational account than an advocacy account. And the reason why I say that is because the way that he's talking about credentialism and this upward educational attainment sort of spiral is that it has become to use the word over and over again, an institutionalized characteristic of our education system. In other words, there are more and more people participating in mass education every generation to the point where it is almost saturated in most places worldwide. And as saturation occurs at the primary level, then the next generation tends to seek out saturation at the secondary level, and then the next generation will seek out saturation at the tertiary or the higher education level. And you can see how it continues to go up and up and up. And so I mean, from my reading of the Schooled Society, that's the approach that he's giving. And so I wonder how you're contrasting that. I wonder how we can contrast that with Doerr's perspective, that this is a sort of a pointless upward requirement. Because I think the way that Baker's saying is yes, it may be pointless, but there's still a rational expectation that higher levels of education and more credentials will then correspond with higher levels of economic productivity or higher transition rates into the labor market, which we know they don't do necessarily. We know that there's a disconnect. And I think that's the interesting point about the Baker approach. So, this person goes on to say, I question how entry-level this is if it still requires prior experience. Despite all the value we place on degrees in higher education, coming upon a requirement for work experience, even at entry-level positions, tells me that undergraduate and graduate education are not fully preparing students for the work world in a realistic manner, not if the individuals require schooling in the form of work experience to get even the lowest job in the field. So, I love this comment, and I'll tell you why. In particular, because I think it assumes that the labor market is rational itself. In other words, that if undergraduate and graduate educations are not fully preparing students for the work world in a realistic manner, what is that based on? Is that based on the fact that there are these higher levels of entry requirements? Well, what's interesting is that I think we have to have a little bit of basic economics to understand this, right? And the basic economics is the law of supply and demand. The greater the supply, the lower the demand. The lower the supply, the greater the demand. Okay, so in this case, we have a very high supply of highly qualified, highly educated, highly credentialed individuals. And so the demand for those individuals is rather low, which means that the labor market can actually ask for additional requirements beyond what is technically necessary to do the job. In other words, so they will ask for several years of experience. They will ask for master's level things for entry level positions because the supply is so high they can be choosy. Right? It's not because they need that. It's not because those are the required skills or knowledge set that's necessary to do the job, to function in the job. It's because that's what the market can bear. All right. So then the comment goes on, I'm not going to read this whole thing, and goes through each of David Baker's points sort of one by one. And I think that's a really important perspective that this person brings to the discussion. I want to encourage all of you to take a very close look at this because I think it's really interesting the way this critique is laid out. And so I won't go any further. I obviously have a response for a lot of this that comes from my own reading of the Baker text and my own understanding of Ronald Doerr and what's happening in the whole sort of education labor market milieu. But I'm not going to go into all that right now because I think that's for you guys to do on the discussion board with one another. So have at it. I'm going to pause here, and just like that, I'll be back at the slides. Ta-da! We're back. All right, so we're back looking at the slides, and so let's move on and let's talk a little bit about David Baker's approach. And we did this a little bit in class all together last week, but I wanted to go over it again. This is directly out of Chapter 1 from the Baker text, The Schooled Society. And remember that he's making the argument that there's been a fundamental shift in the relationship between education and society. Whereas in the original conceptualization of this, the society was fixed, and that is what then shaped what was happening in school. And so this was the approach, I think, that the comment from the discussion board that we were just looking at takes. In other words, society or occupation is setting what the standards are for education, and then education is responding by ever increasing levels of educational attainment and credential, and then that feeds back into society with all these credentialed people moving along. What Baker is saying is that he's flipping it, and he's saying that there is a new conceptualization of what work is, what expertise is, what knowledge is, what society is, and what human development means. And as a result of that, the relationship between education and society now moves in this direction, where school is, and you'll notice that it doesn't say fixed down here like it did for society, but school is the causal agent, or is the prime agent, and society is the one that's affected more by what school is producing. Now he's making a strong and a provocative argument, because what he wants to emphasize is that there is an idea, see the light bulbs, that goes with each individual about what society needs and what knowledge means and what expertise means, that is defined by education in a way that society never did. And it's defined in education by education in a way that is stable enough, or that is, dare I say the word universal enough, because I don't think that universal is necessarily the exact word I want to use, but is consistent enough that it is dominating over all of the various views that society provides. Now, what we didn't get to look at in much detail in class last week, but I wanted to bring up here, was this figure from Chapter 2. And in this Chapter 2 figure, what he's done is he's identified these beliefs, or these phenomena, that are associated with the institutionalization of education worldwide, that are relatively core to how school impacts society. So for example, this belief that all students, all people should learn, that schooling adapts to students' abilities more than knowledge does. These are ideas that we have embedded in our educational system as an institution, which means that even though these beliefs might have an origin in a Western ideology, they have been embedded in the cultural and sort of organizational institution of education, to the degree that anywhere there is education, formal education or mass education in the form of schooling, these sorts of beliefs and values will follow. He also points out that educational expansion has occurred, and that investment in human capacity through schooling as a model of societal progress has become one of the more accepted or less questioned ways of thinking about what the point of education is. And that education has expanded to the degree that there is saturation. I've used this word already once, but I'm going to use it again. Saturation in terms of how many people have participated in formal education and how many people are going to participate in following generations, not just in the West, not just in the place where I'm sitting, the United States, but worldwide. So as a result, we have widespread credentialing. We have social problems, and their solutions are defined educationally. In other words, school dropouts are defined as deviants. That, on the other hand, there's growing private investment in education because it is seen as such an important and a fundamental component of society that privatizing it is the next wave of power and authority, or management and governance, that we're going to see related to education. And then finally, we have the saliency for knowledge and academic intelligence, and the loss of saliency for vocationalism and classical form of knowledge, meaning that the idea that there is an expert type of knowledge that is achieved through higher order cognitive skills has become ingrained and embedded in us to the degree that even when there is a vocation or an occupation that someone is training for, they're going to be trained in higher order thinking skills in addition to the actual technical components of whatever it is they're doing. So if they're learning how to fix Coca-Cola vending machines, which by the way I knew a guy in college who did that as a side job and he made tons of money, so it's a lucrative position, but it is a very technical skill. I mean, you know how to do that, you know how to do that well. It's not that there is any sort of higher order cognitive skill that goes with that. If you're trained how to do it, then you do it. And I think my friend who did this would suggest that's the way that he went about it as well. So the idea of synergistic cultural meaning from these core values means that there is this emphasis on each of these core values of education as an institution actually influencing the way that society develops rather than vice versa. Now we can go on and we can see how this is, let me see if I can get this. There we go. So you can see